The worst atrocity since October the 7th against Jewish people has happened in Australia, and I regret to say that I believe that the Albanese government has effectively turned a blind eye to a whole series of Jew-hating events, and now, of course, we have this unspeakable massacre at Bondi Beach. So it's a slur against our country, what's happened, but I'm afraid it's been, if you like, licensed by weakness on the part of government.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Well, hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Today we'll be discussing the massacre at Bondi, the causes of it and what to do next. Tony, thanks for joining us. Obviously, tragedy doesn't begin to express what happened at Bondi. I think the term tragedy has an element of passivity to it, as if a natural disaster had occurred, but this was a calculated, premeditated, cold-blooded murder of 15 Jewish people, but also 15 Australians. My assessment is it's not just an attack on Jews, it's an attack on our country, it's an attack on all Australians, and I worry that our country is forever changed by this terrible act of evil. So to start with, let's get your overall assessment and your sentiments to the events that took place at Bondi.
Well, you're right, Dan. Tragedy does not adequately describe it at all. This was an atrocity. This was a deliberate hunting down of people who happened to be Jewish, and it was really an attack on the Australian way of life, because we are a country which has historically welcomed Jewish people. Jewish people have risen to the greatest heights in our nation. They've been a wonderful part of Australia from the beginning. They should be an honoured part of our country. As far as I'm concerned, they always will be an honoured part of our country. And yet what we had was two Islamist gunmen hunting them down without mercy in an iconic location. So yes, an absolutely dreadful black mark against us and our country. I think it's telling that the worst atrocity against Jewish people since October the 7th happened here in Australia. Nothing like this has happened in the United States. Nothing like this has happened in Britain. Nothing like this has happened in Europe. The worst atrocity since October the 7th against Jewish people has happened in Australia. And I regret to say that I believe that the Albanese government has failed to create a climate of safety and respect for Jewish people. The government has effectively turned a blind eye to a whole series of anti-Jewish, Jew-hating events, whether that was the initial elation of Islamist preachers in response to October the 7th, whether it was the appalling October the 9th riot outside the Opera House where we heard such hateful things shouted and screamed against Jews, whether it was the march across the Sydney Harbour Bridge displaying terrorist flags and talking about globalising the Intifada and death to the IDF. There's been a whole series of escalating hate incidents against Jewish people and against Jewish institutions. And now, of course, we have this unspeakable massacre at Bondi Beach. So it's a slur against our country, what's happened. But I'm afraid it's been, if you like, licensed by weakness on the part of government, because we know from history that if you have enough incitements to violence, if incitements to violence are tolerated, sooner or later there will be violence. And I just think that this government, indeed our nation's leadership at every level, should be hanging its head in shame. And I just think that the Prime Minister, if he's to redeem himself, needs to, if you like, make a clean breast of his government's errors up till now, apologise, if you like, to Australians generally, but particularly to Jewish Australians, and start doing what should have been done all along. Deport hate preachers, prosecute people who incite violence against anyone, but particularly against Jewish people, and ban these hate marches. I mean, who is in charge here? Is it the police? Is it the elected and accountable government? Or is it these activists who are constantly exceeding themselves in their expressions of contempt, disdain, their incitements to violence against Jewish people and certainly against Israelis?
Well, I believe that the Bondi attacks are Australia's 9/11. I think it is an act of war. It's an act of war against Australia, and as you say, against our way of life. And the most appalling part of this has been the fact that the government has continued as if it's just another day. I mean, they are seeking just to manage this politically. They are obviously worried about the Islamic people voting for them, and that's the only rubric through which they look at these issues. And I think to blame guns, to blame hate speech is pathetic and embarrassing. Guns don't cause people to have a murderous ideology. That is the problem. We have the wrong people in this country, and the government refuses to act on this. And so I want to get your assessment of the government's response, and then we can talk about the opposition's response as well.
Yeah, well, plainly, the government wants to make this all about gun control, and I accept that something is wrong if a guy living in Western Sydney, in metropolitan Sydney, has access to 6 long arms. I mean, there is something wrong with gun laws, or at least with the administration of the gun regime, if something like this could happen, especially given that family members have been apparently known to ASIO. But try to make it all about guns is a smokescreen for the fact that this government has done nothing to crack down on the Jew hatred. And it's not so much the gun, it's the person who pulled the trigger. It's not so much the weapon, it's the hatred that motivated its use. And this is what the government has lamentably failed to deal with. So there is now this attempt to say, oh, nothing to see here. Let's give each other a big hug. The terrorists were trying to divide us. They were trying to cause division. Well, no, they were trying to kill people, and they were trying to kill people who were Jewish, and they were trying to kill people because they don't like the Australian way of life, which respects people of all religions, which believes that all are equal in the eyes of God. So I think that not only has the government failed to adequately deal with the rampant anti-Semitism in our midst over the last 2 years, but now it's trying to sneak away from its culpability here by saying, oh, look, we're going to do something about guns. Well, fair enough, do something about guns, but don't think that's the end of the matter, Prime Minister. You've got to do something about the rampant Jew hatred which has motivated this appalling massacre.
The other piece of information that's interesting is apparently one of the individuals had citizenship of India. And I've often been a skeptic of dual citizenship in the sense of I've been a skeptic of dual loyalty. And I think it's time to, at a minimum, have a conversation about dual citizenship and whether that's still appropriate. I'm not saying that you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do find it interesting that this seemed to have been used as a mechanism to get into the Philippines, to go to the training camp, and then to come to Australia. My point being that this was years in the making. How did our intelligence agencies not know about this? Or did they know about it and Albanese didn't want to hear it?
Well, there's no doubt that the Prime Minister has been at pains not to talk about radical militant Islam. For instance, ever since the October 7 atrocity and the rampant anti-Semitism on our streets, he's been at pains to couple anti-Semitism with Islamophobia, an almost non-existent Islamophobia, because, as you say, he's been anxious about Islamic voters in cabinet ministers' seats in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I'm not saying ignore the voting public, but in the end, the best way to deal with the voting public, regardless of their religion or ethnicity, is to treat them as Australians. And as we saw on the weekend, there were some people who happened to be Muslim who acted like decent, brave Australians in a situation of peril. They tried to intervene. And good on them, God bless them for that. But at the same time, we've got this militant, Jew-hating, Islamist ideology, which the Prime Minister has been incredibly coy about naming and about calling out. It was only 48 hours after this atrocity that he finally brought himself to say softly that there was an extremist, perverted version of Islam abroad. Well, yes, Prime Minister, thanks finally for noticing this. Really, we should have been doing so much more about this, and we should have been doing so much more about this for many years.
The other component is to do with hate speech. I know Premier Minns has been pushing more so-called anti-hate speech laws. Again, this is a cop-out. You cannot legislate away hate. We have some of the most draconian anti-free speech laws in the Western world. That didn't stop this happening. More anti-free speech laws won't stop this happening again. And the issue is not so much what people are saying, though that is a problem. The problem is that we have thousands of people in our country who believe this stuff, and you cannot legislate this away. There is no anti-radicalisation program that's going to stop this. And the other issue here is many of these people are citizens of our country, some of whom are natural-born citizens. And I don't think any of our political leaders are actually willing to acknowledge and to deal with this problem that we have imported hate, and you can't legislate that issue away.
Well, 2 points in response, Dan. First of all, I agree with you. We don't need more laws against hate speech. We need the existing laws enforced. And I think that there's been quite a double standard when it comes to enforcing hate speech laws. If you or I say something which is offensive to Muslims, for instance, we're likely to be in all sorts of trouble. But radical Islamists can say what they like in terms of globalising the Intifada, murdering the IDF, F the Jews, gas the Jews, etc., and nothing happens. So I think there's nothing wrong with the laws as they stand. They just need to be enforced equally as opposed to partially. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is, yes, we should not import hatreds from overseas. And this is why the government's, I suppose, insouciance about issuing 3,000 tourist visas to people from Gaza, about bringing back the so-called ISIS brides, is so difficult to fathom. I mean, Gaza is a terrorist-controlled war zone, or at least most of it has been until recently. Why on earth would we bring people to this country from Gaza without the sorts of security checks which are simply impossible at this time? Why would we issue them visas without being absolutely confident that they are people who accept our values and embrace our way of life? So we have failed as a nation. I mean, when you look, Dan, at the post-war migration program and compare it with more recent official attitudes, the post-war migration program was a great success because the new Australians, as we called them back then, were expected to integrate from day one and ultimately to assimilate. And the idea was that their children would go to normal Australian schools and they would become first-class Australians, completely comfortable with the Australian way of life. Then, in the Whitlam era and beyond, we had this doctrine of multiculturalism. Now, if multiculturalism simply meant that people would adapt to Australia in their own way and at their own pace, I suppose that's fair enough. But what it has often tended to mean is that the government funds people who become, if you like, ethnic activists, excuse me, who have a vested interest in keeping people separate from the Australian mainstream and who have a vested interest in claiming that there's been discrimination, that there's been racism, even though modern Australia, the Anglo-Celtic core culture, is the world's most welcoming. And even though modern Australia, the Judeo-Christian value system, is the world's most universal. So I think that for a couple of generations now, we've been essentially on the wrong track. The terms I often use are Team Australia, which is what everyone should be expected to join from the moment they get here, or Hotel Australia, which is what too many of our recent migrants are living in. For instance, the senior of this week's terrorists has apparently been living in this country for almost 30 years without ever becoming a permanent resident, without becoming a citizen, without making the citizenship pledge to Australia and its people, and he's been allowed to do that. Well, in the time he's been here, he's made many trips back to the subcontinent. He's made, it seems, a recent trip to the Philippines, where it's quite likely that he engaged in terrorist training at Islamist camps in the southern Philippines. This is not what Australia should be all about. I mean, the Australian project since 1788 has been to welcome people to a better life on the basis that they wholeheartedly embrace life in this country and they wholeheartedly embrace Australian values, which again I stress, it's essentially an Anglo-Celtic culture and it's absolutely a Judeo-Christian ethos, and at the heart of the Judeo-Christian ethos is the idea that all people are equal in the eyes of God. We don't discriminate on the basis of religion or race or gender. We have complete freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion. And I have to say, Dan, that it's very difficult for people who adhere to a strict version of Islam to also accept the Australian way of life.
Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you who are watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the action. And while you're at it, head to ipa.org.au and follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website, so that way you will find all of our research and analysis. Now, back to the chat.
What is it that, if you were Prime Minister at this time and this event happened when you were Prime Minister, how is it that you think you would have responded to this, both in terms of the, I guess, your initial reaction, but also in terms of how to fix this issue? Partly it's also a question of, well, what do we do with the people that are here that hate our country? What do you do with those people?
Well, I think we just have to have a much stronger emphasis on Australian values. And one of the ways that we should have emphasised Australian values is by deporting hate preachers, by prosecuting people who are inciting violence against others, and by banning these hate marches. And none of that has been done. I mean, this is a government which refused visas to hardline members of the Israeli government, but as far as we're aware, has not deported a single hate preacher, again, because of its anxieties about the Islamist vote in certain parts of Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I suppose, Dan, I would look at what I did as Prime Minister in the aftermath of the Lindt Cafe siege, an earlier Islamist terror event. We dealt with it very forcefully, and I certainly spent a lot of time in subsequent days, weeks and months calling out Islamist extremism. You might remember that this was the heyday of Islamic State when this death cult was beating up against the doors of Baghdad. We deployed considerable armed forces to the Middle East to help the Iraqi government resist Islamic State. We certainly boosted the resources available to ASIO, the AFP, and we certainly absolutely stressed that extreme Islam is not compatible with the Australian way of life and should have no place in our country.
The other component of this was the choice of the setting, which is Bondi Beach, which I don't think is a mistake. We had those hate marches taking place at the Sydney Opera House. And of course, Bondi is not just a beach, it's a national and global icon. And, tragically, I don't think that beach and that place will ever be the same. It is, of course, also the setting of, I think, the world's first life-saving club back in 1907. Was debated, as they claim it.
Manly would say it was the first, but
well, you're a bit parochial.
We're now getting into some very parochial things, Dan.
Right,
yeah.
But I think maybe the one silver lining was the individual who tackled the gunman, and I think in doing so lived out that spirit of self-sacrifice by the volunteers who basically set up that club to stop people dying in the ocean. So that's probably the one silver lining we can take at the present moment.
Completely correct, Dan. If there is anything that was reassuring in these horrible events, it's the fact that so many people ran to the danger rather than against the danger, starting with the elderly Jewish couple that was shot after attempting to disarm the terrorists as they were getting out of their Islamic State flagged car. And then, of course, we had Ahmed El-Ahmed, who heroically disarmed one of the terrorists for a time, a Muslim gentleman, and who was then shot for his trouble. So this, in the end, it's about religiously motivated hatred, and the tragedy is that the one religion which seems to have this death to the infidel mindset is Islam. That doesn't mean that every Muslim has it by any means. Look at Ahmed El-Ahmed and some of the others who did things to help their fellow Australians on the weekend. But that version of Islam that says that infidels deserve death, that version of Islam that says society should be run on a Sharia law basis, that version of Islam that seeks a global caliphate, that's something that needs to change. And one of the things that I hope might come out of this, or might be reinforced by this, is the idea that in countries like Australia, where it is safe to be, if you like, a moderate Muslim, where it is safe to be a proponent of a much more genial Islam, we might have more good Muslim leaders emerge who say that death to the infidel should have no place in Islam. Sharia law is something that was more appropriate for the Middle Ages than for today. Live and let live has got to be at the heart of contemporary Islam if it is to flourish.
I agree with you, but I might have missed this, so happy to be corrected, but I haven't heard any Muslim leaders say that. And that's why the community is concerned about it. I'm sure there are some who think it, and maybe there are some at their local mosques who say it, but in terms of those in influential leadership positions, I've never heard any of them say that.
I understand your scepticism, Dan. There was a statement from, I think, the Imams Council put out in the immediate aftermath of the Bondi massacre, condemning what had happened. But you're right. Muslim spokesmen, at least the Muslim spokesmen that get quoted in the media, in this country at least, tend to be the ones who are complaining about Islamophobia and saying that they are persecuted and discriminated against, which I think is completely wrong. I know that in the Middle East, for instance, or in parts of the Middle East, there are Muslim spokesmen who stand up for what I regard as decency. there was a famous speech that President al-Sisi of Egypt made to Al-Azhar University in early 2015, where he berated his fellow Muslims for tolerating for centuries attitudes and actions which brought Islam into disrepute and which turned the world against Islam. Understandably, he said. I was just this morning listening to some footage of a Muslim preacher from the Emirates who was condemning what had happened on Bondi Beach on Sunday. At the same time, of course, we had Hamas, an entity which I think the current government has been insufficiently critical of. We had Hamas welcoming this atrocity as somehow exactly what Jewish people deserved. Well, no. Wrong, 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 evil, evil, evil. And we just can't tolerate this.
The opposition's response, so Susan Lee has, I think, been somewhat forceful in what she has said. I'm not sure that she's necessarily willing to go as far as probably what is needed to talk about. In essence, this is a failure of our migration program and intelligence agencies.
Well, it's a failure at many levels. I mean, over the last couple of years, it's been a failure of the government to speak out and to act adequately against rampant anti-Semitism. Beyond that, yes, it's been a failure over many years to properly emphasise Australian values and to properly expect migrants from different backgrounds to thoroughly Australianise as quickly as possible. So there have been multiple failures here. I think the principal immediate failure is that of the Albanese government. And look, I think Susan's statement the other day when she said that the government has treated Jew hatred as a political problem to be managed rather than as a moral evil to be eradicated was actually a pretty good analysis of exactly what the government has failed to grasp. I think Susan's been showing pretty good spine in recent times on a range of policy issues, and my view is that I suppose as a loyal Liberal, I should do my best to support and encourage the leadership of the party to be their best selves, and I think Susan has been strong on this. I think others, such as James Patterson, have been very strong on this. Andrew Hastie spoke very strongly about this. One or two Labor people have spoken out strongly, but again, the difficulty seems to be that first they're worried about their Western Sydney and Western Melbourne seats. Second, they're a bit, I think, contaminated by this cultural Marxism, which sees Jews as possessing white privilege and Israel as being an exemplar of settler colonialism. And third, there's just this general cultural relativism which says that all cultures are the same, and what right have I got to speak out against someone who claims to be acting out of a sense of their own cultural righteousness? Well, I'm sorry. Anything which says that it's all right to kill innocent people because they happen to be Jewish or they happen to be Australians who don't live under the caliphate, anything that claims that that's all right is completely wrong, and it's just got to be called out.
The Labor Party, I mean, one way of thinking about it is one of the biggest national security risks we face is the Australian Labor Party, given that they are now so deep down this politically motivated policy making where foreign policy, national security, immigration policy is all being driven by these considerations around Western Sydney seats. Is the modern Labor Party redeemable from this? I mean, I think it is now itself a serious risk to our nation's future.
The difficulty with the Labor Party at the moment is that essentially it's a party of social justice campaigners, and they just don't get national security. And in the end, many of them don't that much like Australia. They think that we are a society riddled with injustice, with discrimination. They angst over the fact that Indigenous people were dispossessed after 1788. And I think this is what constrains their response to issues of national security, whether it's domestic terrorism motivated by Islamist extremism, or indeed aggression by the Chinese Communist Party regime in the South China Sea or elsewhere. They did not go into politics to deal with this kind of thing. They went into politics to increase welfare payments. They went into politics to give greater rights to minorities. They went into politics to change the flag and become a republic, to introduce a voice and things like that. That's what they went into politics to do. And I think it's very hard for many of the senior members of the Labor Party to change gear.
Just on the voice, I mean, I think it is... The Prime Minister has no credibility when he talks about wanting to unify the country, because he was the one, his very first act as newly elected Prime Minister. Well, firstly, when he was elected 2022, he gave an acknowledgement of country, of course. And then he said, we're doing a voice treaty in truth. So how can you then spend $500 million and the first half of your first term dividing our country by race and then complain about the country being divided? I mean, Anthony Albanese has been an accelerant to the division in our country, and he's not the right person to take us forward. And this is why a growing number of people are calling on him to resign. He's not going to resign anytime soon, but the country's not going to be fixed under the current leadership.
It was noteworthy this week that he was almost trying to bring a therapeutic approach to this. I mean, he stood up at one press conference with the New South Wales Premier, who was much stronger, I hasten to add. He stood up with Chris Minns and he started to reel off a list of the hotline numbers for various mental health organisations. Well, yes, I suppose there are people in our community who've been traumatised by these events, but the job of the government is not so much therapy. The job of the government is safety. We don't want government to hug us. We want government to keep us safe. And this idea that the Jewish community needs to be embraced and that terrorists are just trying to divide us, and sure, they're trying to divide us, but they're dividing us by killing us. And this is where we need such a vastly more robust response.
Just to finish off, Tony, what's next, I guess, in your assessment? I mean, where does the country go from here, whether it's politically or as a nation? How do we sort of go forward from this?
Well, plainly, we do need to examine what weaknesses there were in our awareness of Islamist terror and of these particular people. I think we do need to bolster our security and intelligence services. I do think we need to get much more serious about taking strong, immediate action against hate preaching, incitement to violence and hate marches. I do think that we need to be much more rigorous in looking into the backgrounds and attitudes of people who are getting visas to come long-term to Australia. And I think overarching all of this has got to be this insistence that we are a fundamentally Anglo-Celtic country with an essentially Judeo-Christian ethos, and we expect everyone to join our team. I mean, I just want to finish on this note, Dan. Since the convict era, no one has come involuntarily to Australia. I think it's safe to assume that everyone who comes to Australia because they like at least some of what they've seen. So we do no one any favours, least of all our migrants, if we connive at drastic changes to our country. This idea that because so many of our recent migrants have come from non-English speaking backgrounds, we should somehow abandon our essentially Anglo-Celtic culture, and we should somehow abandon our essentially British institutional inheritance is just dead wrong. In fact, I think it's more important than ever that we stress, emphasise, cherish and preserve them.
On that note, Tony, we'll leave it there, and this is our last chat for the year, and it's beyond disappointing that it's ended on this note, but thank you for a year of chats, and we'll pick it up again next year, so thank you.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yes, it is. It's just woeful that we've seen this awful atrocity in our midst, but hopefully some good will come of it. We will treat this as a wake-up call, and we will be better and stronger in the years to come.
Thank you, Tony.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.